that.
Oh, hi!
Welcome to Moire. I'm sorry, not Moire, Moire. Oh, that's better, thank you. This is a moire pattern, a type of interference pattern in which one set of lines or circles is overlaid onto another. They can be disorienting, but if you stare long enough, new patterns or images tend to emerge. I want this channel to carry that same energy. In the spirit of writers like Jacob Geller, Tim Rogers, and Noah Caldwell-Gervais, I want to explore games and where they intersect with other games, with larger cultural phenomena, and with myself as a person. Of course, it would be possible to find endless points of intersection here, endless iterations of these same patterns. In this way, moire patterns only seem to make sense in the ephemeral snapshots that our minds cobble together. I hope to share some of my snapshots with you, and I promise not to navel gaze too much. Some small things before we get started. This isn't a product review, it's also not an analysis of the game systems from a design standpoint, or a rigorous academic examination of Camus' ideas. If these interest you, I'll have links in the description. And if you couldn't tell by the title or the description of this channel, it's hardly even a video about Hades. Heck, I barely mention it until part 2, and buddy, this isn't even part 1. As for the question of what the video is, I would encourage you to watch and find out. Finally, this video will be more enjoyable if you've played through Hades. I'm not going to describe the plot in great detail, but there will be spoilers. By the way, I won't announce spoilers. Consider this a sort of spoiler jump scare bonanza and watch at your own risk. Finally, before starting this video, make sure you're comfortable dealing with death, suicide, and substance abuse. In his long essay, The Myth of Sisyphus, Albert Camus defines the absurd like this. What, then, is that incalculable feeling that deprives the mind of the sleep necessary to life? A world that can be explained, even with bad reasons, is a familiar world. But, on the other hand, in a universe suddenly divested of illusions and lights, man feels an alien, a stranger. His exile is without remedy, since he is deprived of the memory of a lost home or the hope of a promised land. This divorce between a man and his life, the actor in his setting, is properly the feeling of absurdity. This is how Camus defines the absurd, but what does that really mean? Well, let me ask you a question. Have you ever been to a baseball game? Maybe, like me, you enjoy baseball as a sport, but everything surrounding the game seems like an odd distraction. The performance of the national anthem by a local grade school choir before the game, the kiss cam, the Coca-Cola home run box, the extended breaks between innings for commercials, and so on. This is baby's first brush with the absurd. Why does baseball need public displays of affection or appeals to nationalism? This simplified conception of absurdity is simply the inclusion of things that don't belong. Unfortunately, absurdity gets a lot more complicated. Camus understood absurdity as the true nature of reality. He claimed that we live in a world devoid of inherent meaning that cannot be well rationalized. There are, of course, broader socio-political reasons for baseball's conventions and other cultural meaning-making devices. However, I don't think talking about those reasons will really make anyone understand absurdity. For the sake of this essay, let's consider absurdity as an experiential phenomenon. By this, I mean that the social trappings surrounding sports in the United States are arbitrary and do lack inherent meaning, but they aren't absurd in themselves. Instead, they spark a feeling of absurdity in the baseball fan who has suddenly recognized and questioned this arbitrariness. And to make things more complicated, absurdity and our relationship to it extends far beyond the world of professional sports. My journey with Hades is more than a fun game with delightfully horny art. Starts in a warehouse where I packed frozen diet food for a logistics company. We'll call this the Burger Mines.
Man, are you sure about this whole Burger Mine thing? It seems like you're undercut.
It was a winter morning in 2021 around 5 a.m. Sunlight peeked over the horizon like a sleepy kid who doesn't want to get up for school. I sat on the hood of my car, cold wind freezing my lungs as I drew from my vape pen, wishing the sun would rise a little faster. From 5:30 until 4 in the evening, I would be in a 25-degree freezer. At that time of year, my 2 breaks and my half-hour lunch comprised most of the sunlight I saw during the work week. The rest of the day would be spent on the line. The line was a series of rollers with rows of frozen food and flashing lights where 3 people stood in a space with roughly 12 feet on either side of them. Because I was somewhat quick, I worked in the middle, which was mostly fancy Hot Pockets and burgers. To my right was T, an older woman who had been a warehouse picker for decades, and to my left in the back of the line was D, who never said much. I could visualize how the next 10 hours would go. T would slide a cooler down a set of rollers to me. I would scan a barcode. Wherever flashing lights popped up, I would scan the corresponding food item and take however many it told me to. When no more lights were flashing, I would pass the cooler down to D. Repeat this 400 times a day, shuffling sideways along the same 24 feet of freezer space because you couldn't turn your body around unless you wanted to be in someone's way. It was a sickeningly rationalized space to occupy. I know it was a Friday because our normal work week was 4 days, and when you have to spend an extra 10 hours a week in a freezer, you're pretty well aware of it. T, who had carpal tunnel and some form of arthritis, likely from decades as a warehouse picker, was slowing down as we neared our first break, stepping back to shake out her hands. She turned to me and yelled in my ear with her smoker's rasp, "Don't worry, I've got extra pills." T often took a concoction of muscle relaxers, NSAIDs, caffeine, and nicotine to get through the day, especially as we neared the end of the week. On a long work week, even that only helped so much. I told her, "I ain't worried about it, whatever you're comfortable with." T shook her head. "Once my meds kick in, we'll get these fuckers off the line and get the fuck out of here." I told her again that I wasn't worried about it before turning back to my cooler. I told her this for 2 reasons. The first being that I had seen her overwork herself to the point of tears before, and selfishly I really didn't like seeing that. The other reason is that I actually wasn't worried. It was a pointless job if there ever was one. Before going back to her section, T protested. "Fuck that, man, they're watching me. I gotta keep up if I want them to keep me on, and I got enough points against me." Every employee was, in fact, being monitored, our production numbers being assessed by the quarter hour to see if we were earning our $13.50 hourly wage. This was a big deal for most of the pickers, not because anyone would be disciplined, but because we were almost all temps, and many of us were trying to get hired on by the company itself for better pay and benefits. But it was hard to get hired on by the company. You accrued points for low production days and days where you had to leave or days where you couldn't show up. Get enough points and there was no way they'd hire you on. Although they might extend your temp contract. I didn't say anything to T. In fact, I may have nodded or I may have just continued working, but something in me was starting to sour at the thought of her hoping to get hired on by the company. A lot of the temps were temps for 2 reasons. They had spotty employment history, like the guy who took the bus an hour and a half one way to work because he had a criminal record and couldn't easily find employment directly through a company, or like T, they had a history of injuries that made them less reliable at warehouse work. Many of these people got stuck in a cycle of temp work, either renewing their contracts at the end of the term or going elsewhere in hopes of finding a permanent job. This relationship between the company and the temps was maintained by the strict rationalization of the burger mines. For the most part, the monitoring of production numbers and even movement efficiency on the line created an imbalance of knowledge that could either not affect you at all or work against you with rare exceptions. This sour feeling only grew more intense when, during our break, T asked me if I'd ever looked at the invoice prices in the coolers we filled. "You look at a lot of them," she said. "It's more than what we make in a day." I nodded and said something of no consequence. I knew how much a month of this diet food costs, the expense of a basic meal plan for one person, roughly a quarter of what a picker would make in a month. I couldn't help but think why this woman had to destroy her hands to make a living. Her hands run raw, so rich people could have overpriced Lancashire sandwiches with turkey or leaner beef. How have we arrived at a world where this woman's well-being was dependent on something so trivial to the people who consumed it? It's a problem endemic to warehouse work. I've also previously worked for a large shipping company that we'll call the package mines in 2020.
Oh, come on, man. The package mines? Are we talking about labor and exploitation or a video game or what? What's your
While there, I'd felt the same sour feeling fester inside me due to the disconnect between shipping workers being heralded as heroes on one hand, and the fact that we started work before 3 a.m. only to be pushed to work harder and harder because of the stress placed on shipping infrastructure on the other. Because increasingly trivial items were being bought online and shipped instead of being purchased in a store, life as a shipping worker had escalated in difficulty. This sour feeling was rooted in the disconnect inherent in being a low-level warehouse worker in the United States. To be both necessary and expendable, to work jobs both meaningless and extremely stressful, was to know absurdity. The socio-economic reasons for and solutions to this absurdity are beyond the scope of this video, but Hades is informative about navigating the experience of the absurd. It's a game where we might confront the idea of staring an all-powerful system in the face that, for the time being, we can't change so much as try to navigate it as best we can, person to person. We'll return to this later after delving into the game itself. I know this seems stilted for a game where you can punch giant rats or a hydra with lightning fists. Heck, you can even punch Hades himself with lightning fists. But bear with me here. In a man's attachment to life, there is something stronger than all the ills in the world. The body's judgment is as good as the mind's, and the body shrinks from annihilation. We get into the habit of living before acquiring the habit of thinking. When starting Hades for the first time, the player is totally in the dark about the story's world and the character's motivations. You're plopped into a dungeon you don't yet know is Tartarus, and you swing a sword at beings you instinctively know are enemies. You go through several chambers repeating this process, picking up darkness and nectar that you aren't sure how you'll use. If you're lucky or an experienced hack-and-slash player, you might make it to the game's first boss, Megara. She and Zag clearly know each other, although their conversation doesn't illuminate much to you. If you're better at games than I am, you might even beat her and go on to Asphodel, completely unaware of what's motivating Zag. And if you're a lot better at games than I am, you can theoretically beat Hades on the first run. And in video games, as in real life, you generally want to do two things: not die and beat the final boss. Although, in real life, the final boss is probably something you wouldn't expect to see in a video game. Something like, I don't know, student loan debt, or your parents, or hey, a theoretical perfect first run-through of the game highlights its potential for absurdity. Camus writes, comparing the working man to Sisyphus, that the workman of today works every day in his life at these same tasks, and this fate is no less absurd. In this theoretical perfect first run-through, a player succeeds simply because it's what they know to do, in the same way one returns anew to the burger mines each day. You play the game and beat it often because you bought it. You bought the game because it caught your eye. You go to the burger mines because you need a job. You need a job to pay for your living expenses. In each case, you, the player and/or burger miner, have marginal concern for anything outside of your immediate needs and situation. In fact, doing so may make each task feel utterly pointless. But let's not stay too long on this idea of the perfect run for one obvious reason. You will die eventually. This death screen will become familiar to you. Zagreus blood gushing beneath text that reads, "There is no escape." In a successful run, you're greeted with a kinder death screen. Well, as kind as death can be. It reads, "Taken by the sticks," but the result is the same. Zagreus slips into that red river, beginning his descent once again into the house of Hades. You will die, and that's a good thing. In the passage that opened this part of the video, Camus considers suicide as a response to confronting the absurd, and finds it lacking. His essay is about literal suicide, which he considers the ultimate expression of existential despair, but there's more to it. For Camus, suicide is one of two poor resolutions to recognizing the absurd, the other being its opposite, hope. There is a middle point between these two, often called lucidity, but we'll cover that more in depth later. T was full of hope. Despite her health problems, she was convinced she was a good week, good defined as productive to her supervisors, from being hired on through the company. Suicide also existed in warehouse work, although I never saw it manifest in the dramatic band-aid rip we often imagine. At the package mines during peak season, some people would show up to work having not slept and still drunk from the night before. You might hear this and think, okay, whatever, I mean, who hasn't shown up to work drunk once or twice on accident? But for at least some of these people, this was the case most days of all 16 to 20 weeks that I worked there. And I don't care who you are, that's a hell of a bender. There were actually a couple fistfights when I worked there too. It was, this one time I was really worried. Package handler I really liked to clown on people, so nobody really liked him too much, but he almost got a fist fight with a manager, and the guy was a lot bigger and stronger than him, so I was worried about that, but then I was like, oh, what if he loses his job? What if they get fired? Well, nobody got fired for this. You actually almost can't get fired from there. Alright, sorry about the distraction, let's get back to Hades. I don't say this as a joke, but Hades takes the player on a journey from suicidal despair to existential hope to lucidity in both immediate and roundabout ways. To clarify, I'll point out some important traits of roguelikes according to the Berlin definition of roguelikes, then work my way through this claim. You can find a more comprehensive definition on Wikipedia, by the way. Procedurally generated levels, permadeath, turn-based combat, non-modality, game systems that give players freedom in dealing with situations, resource management, hack-and-slash gameplay, and a focus on discovery including dungeon layouts and item effects which may be randomized. Since the 1980 release of Rogue, many games have used varying degrees of these traits, leading to the somewhat fluid terms roguelike and roguelite. Since the industry and critical success of The Binding of Isaac, a renaissance for the genre began that flushed the gaming environment with new, often pleasant roguelite experiences. Although I may sound like Werner Herzog talking about penguins,
even if he caught him and brought him back to the colony, he would immediately head right back for the mountains. But why?
After playing a number of these games, including Rogue, NetHack, Tales of Majal, Realm of the Mad Gods, Spelunky, Risk of Rain, Binding of Isaac, Faster Than Light, Dark Dungeon, Dead Cells, and Hades, I can say that they all speak in some way to the absurdity of human existence. Actually, I don't mind if I sound like Werner Herzog here because he's right. In the words of my brother, who's a biologist, mind you,
Herzog punctuates something that is perhaps important about being a vertebrate animal capable of motion but is often thought of as purely human, that the plasticity machine which is the brain sometimes produces some really fucking comically bad results.
To explain what I'm pretty sure he meant here, let me take you to a little place I like to call the joke zone. It's kinda like this. Sometimes you're the chicken and sometimes you're the egg. Okay, let me try that again. Sometimes you're the dog and sometimes you're the nail. That's close enough. They'll know what I mean. And here's what I mean when I say that roguelikes speak to the absurdity of human existence. Have you considered that, just as you must manage your resources in Faster Than Light, or you'll get stuck in outer space, you also have to manage your resources in real life, or you'll be sent to the poorhouse like Charles Dickens' dad. On second thought, I don't think I can actually explain this in the joke zone at all. There are many inescapable realities in our lives. For some of us, that's the burger mines. For others, it's a creative writing degree and a general sense of buffoonery. It's time to get back to the part of the video where, instead of feigning pretension for comedic effect, I participate in real pretension to achieve a different unintended comedic effect. In all seriousness, roguelikes speak to absurdity in the same way that watching a baseball game spoke to absurdity at the beginning of this essay. We can't isolate any individual factor of these games that causes the player to experience the absurd. Rather, the sum of the parts has the potential to lead the player to an experience of the absurd by taking away the player's sense of assuredness in any one of their actions. Discovery contributes to this, especially in games that require more exploration like Rogue or The Binding of Isaac. In Rogue especially, you may find yourself inching along, working out the shape of each room and hopefully revealing any potential enemies. Also in Rogue, potions and items don't have effects that carry over between playthroughs. You even have to name the potions each time you start a new game. You can accidentally kill yourself in the first room of the first dungeon, which means that you'll find yourself holding on to potions until you desperately need them, or until you have a potential counter to an effect like poison. To a lesser extent, this is also carried over to games like The Binding of Isaac, where pills have random effects in each playthrough. Although in Isaac you can unlock items with consistent effects and characters that add replayability and a sense of character progression. Introducing character progression between run-throughs of a roguelike essentially creates a dual gameplay loop. There is the single run-through, which is often completable in one sitting, and then there's the player's entire time spent playing the game, which can only be done in one sitting once. In my own experience, this dual loop often creates an interesting tension between the run-through and the total playtime. From the perspective of a single run, decisions in Rogue, Isaac, and even Hades do seem to carry some weight to them. For instance, if you drink poison in Rogue, you may lose all of your progress. If you don't manage your keys and bombs well in Isaac, you might find yourself locked out of powerful items as the run progresses. And if you don't pick runes in Hades that work together, you'll likely find yourself in a war of attrition by the time you get to the Temple of Styx. From the perspective of the player's entire time playing the game though, individual runs and the decisions in them often lack weight due to a lack of through lines between these runs. This is most true in Rogue, where there's no through line at all. Admittedly, this could be because I suck at Rogue, but in my experience, my runs and the moments in them all tend to bleed together to the point that I can't distinguish them. This is mostly true for the Binding of Isaac as well, although I do remember the first time I killed Mom's leg, both because I thought I had beaten the game and because I realized that I had only surpassed the first huge barrier to the endgame. This tension here, that decisions are both eminently important and utterly meaningless, is kinda work week-like. See, at work, what's stressful over the course of a day may be totally forgotten over the course of a week. The belief in the imperative nature of the work at the burger mines was contrary to the actual nature of the work. Due to factors I mentioned earlier, it was stressful and inconsequential at the same time. I mean, the diet food system was really just a way in which the wealthy clients didn't have to count their calories or macronutrients. The only thing that made the job important to the workers is that, unlike our clientele, many of us had to worry about food. I mean, not the food we packaged, we couldn't afford that food. Anyway, we recognized our work as not meaningful, and yet having the work meant a lot to us. There's rent, children, and so on to pay for. What makes Hades particularly interesting in regards to the genre's ability to speak to the absurd stems largely from how light of a roguelite it is. While room awards may be randomized, something which can also be altered in your favor, the layouts of each area are fairly regular, and the linearity created by the lack of backtracking makes exploration negligible. You only need to pay attention to the room you're in to find coins, chaos gates, or whatever you're looking for, which is easier than inching your way through every room of every floor in Rogue. As well, unlike many roguelikes, each area ends with the same boss each time you play, except Tartarus, although all three of those bosses are essentially variations on the same theme. The game also gives you a relatively limited number of options in how you deal with any given situation. Although your boons and weapons do give you flexibility in how you kill everything, the only way to get through each room is to kill everything. Hades is, essentially, rogue flavored in the same way a lemon LaCroix is like lemonade.
Hey man, you aren't going to leave this analogy hanging and make it more confusing, are you?
And just like the relationship between lemon LaCroix and lemonade, Hades proves informative to understanding what the heart of the roguelike genre is and what it has to say. The way it does this is somewhat ingenious, even if the above examples might make Hades seem like baby's first roguelike, especially for hardcore fans of the genre. Which isn't even wrong. This is a great game to enter into the genre as long as you're ready for death to be much colder in other games. These gameplay changes, which make Hades the angel food to Rogue's pound cake, are amazing for what they accomplish on top of making the game an enjoyable casual experience that also allows the player to progress. While Hades doesn't deal with as many of the moment-to-moment concerns that many roguelikes do, the developers haven't left an empty space where those concerns once were. Rather, outside of particularly tense moments, it's been offloaded into the long game, which maintains an essential element of roguelikes. Simply put, in Hades, dying is the point. Dying is the point of any roguelike, and even games like Super Meat Boy, where you can see, after clearing a level, every failed run you spent getting down a frame-perfect parabolic arc over a tough obstacle, recur in a humorous parade of Meat Boys jumping into buzzsaws. But in Hades, dying serves two primary purposes. From a gameplay perspective, dying is how you achieve character progression. All of the resources you pick up in your escape attempts, darkness, gems, nectar, ambrosia, titan, bloodfish, etc., can only be spent in the House of Hades, where you return once you die. Darkness, gems, and titan blood all contribute directly to Zag's survivability, which increases Zag's ability to accumulate more resources, which are spent to increase Zag's survivability in an endless loop. Then there's Nectar and Ambrosia, which, although they do contribute to Zag's survivability by eventually rewarding the player with keepsakes and companions that make each run easier, their immediate use in the early game primarily provides insight into the characters around the House of Hades. Simply put, these resources make death a narrative necessity. To uncover the narrative, you have to talk to various characters in the House of Hades and give them either Nectar or Ambrosia, depending on your relationship with them. You can only do this once each time you emerge from the sticks, and that's if you run into the character you're looking for at all. Nectar and Ambrosia thus require the player to accumulate more runs and progress further into these runs to experience the narrative. The importance of resource management, then, is shifted from the moment-to-moment decisions you might make playing Rogue to the long narrative gameplay loop that Hades takes advantage of by tying death to progression. I've only mentioned a few of the things there are to do in the House of Hades, though, all of which are thus tied to Zag's repeated canonical death. You can free Orpheus, Achilles, and Sisyphus from their contract with Hades, go fishing, reignite an old romance, get your adopted mom to talk to her parent again, get friend-zoned, or punch a giant rat with lightning fists. There's basically two things you can't do. Just like in real life, you can't go fishing with your dad, although that has a lot more to do with your dad working at a rock salt packaging plant, and less to do with him being the ruler of the underworld. And you can't escape. You really should have seen that coming. We talked about that earlier. What you wind up with opposite the game's hack-and-slash adventure through hell is a juggling act of exposition and dating sim-like record-keeping that propels both character and player to the next doomed run. You die, you talk to Dusa, you manage your resources, you start your next run. You make it to Persephone and die, you try to talk to Megara but she isn't there. You manage your resources and start your next run. You die and die and die again. If you're really good at the game, you'll die. While I was playing, I couldn't shake the superficial feeling of similarity between this gameplay loop and the Burger Mines. I swear that's a good thing. Just as each run of Hades will be to some degree unpredictable, but ultimately ends the same way regardless of my actions, the workday operated similarly. This is true for me, a burger miner, and for many other disciplines and occupations. It didn't matter how many coolers we filled with frozen food each day, there were always more to do at 5:30 the next morning. On top of that, since I worked for a logistics company that had a contract with the diet food company, there was always some uncertainty in our schedules. Although to their credit my managers did try to avoid this, we may be told until a day or two before that we have a 4-day work week, only to find out at the beginning of Thursday that we worked on Friday. If we had a scheduled doctor's appointment, that still counted against us in the point system, since overtime was mandatory. This feeling that seemed superficial at first, though, resonated not only with the gameplay loop of Hades, but with the plot as well. The plot structure is this. Zagreus, an outsider and troublemaker in the House of Hades, discovers that his family is not what he believes. His mother is not Nyx, but Persephone, a woman he has never met. In order to find her, he attempts to escape Hades. He is aided by the Olympians, to whom Zagreus is lying about coming to visit, and alternately hindered by his father in each run. As successful runs accumulate and Zag talks Persephone more, he becomes aware that the motivations of each group are not what they seem. Hades becomes more of a paternalistic worrywart who feels the need to protect those he cares for, while the Olympians reveal themselves to be spiteful, egotistical, selfish, and prideful. We can see this in the gods' reactions to your decisions in the trial rooms, where you're forced to pick one over the other. More importantly, this is why Persephone doesn't want to return to the House of Hades. She fears that her mother Demeter will not be relieved that her daughter is okay, but spiteful that she did not return to her when she left Hades, a place where she was originally sent because of a pissing match between Zeus and Hades. This is what we might call a real pickle. In the background, Zagreus becomes increasingly aware of the social structure of his father's house, and how it affects Dusa, Achilles, and many other characters. Although Zag can now see these larger machinations, he is clueless about what he should do about them, and his headstrong disregard for the rules at times has negative consequences for other members of the house. In fact, Dusa is even temporarily kicked out of the House of Hades due to Zag's overambition. At one point, Persephone tells Zagreus not to break out of the House of Hades again. It pains her to see her own son die in front of her eyes over and over again. But what does he do? What do you, the player, do?
Shortly afterwards, we saw him heading straight towards the mountains.
You return. You fight through every Skull Smasher and Flame Wheel and Satyr. You kill your own father again to see the mother that Zagreus misses even though he hardly knows her. And why? Because Zagreus feels he must do something to get his mother back to the underworld. And because you are invested in whether or not he will, despite the odds. Both Zagreus and the player cling workmanlike to the illusion that there must be some larger picture. Some motivating reason for the toil of the day. Another fight from Hades and back. I want to return to the sour feeling I mentioned when I talked about tea and working in the burger mines. I want to consider its root in myself not as a sob story, this isn't a video about me, but as a way of thinking about how we do or don't deal with the absurd in our everyday lives. While this was one of a few moments of realization, the sour feeling, the disconnection was a long time in the making. I can look back at the beginning of my grad program where I studied creative writing and taught rhetoric at a university. I had moved out of state to go to grad school and swiftly shed the social connections that I'd made over my entire life. As a then undiagnosed neuroatypical person who had never lived in a one-bedroom apartment by myself before, I found it hard to fill the hole that these social relationships had left. It wasn't that my struggles were exceptional or that I couldn't make friends at all. I did have some friends in grad school. It was a matter of lasting and meaningful relationships. We were different people and our struggles were different, and we had a different emotional language oftentimes. As a result, I found myself increasingly unhappy and unfulfilled, particularly between semesters. Incapable of scratching the dull itch of boredom, I started drinking a lot. I'm not sure how much, but a 30 case of beer over a work week would have been taking it easy. I thought of myself increasingly as an especially stupid person who didn't belong at a university. Whether that's true or not is beside the point. To paraphrase Camus, there was a disconnect between myself and the life I was living. Lacking the skills and/or willpower to deal with this, I was stuck in a pathetic cycle of privileged self-loathing. After limping my thesis through defense, I graduated into a global pandemic. Needless to say, finding a job wasn't going well, but the package mines were hiring. I started using nicotine again, largely to stay awake during my 2 a.m. drive to work. Although I had previously cut down on drinking, largely because I got into weightlifting and running, the drinking returned. I stopped reading and writing around this time, spending my days after schlepping boxes in the early morning, buzzed, and playing Apex Legends. By the time my girlfriend got home from her job, I was already falling asleep. Around this time, I also started having anger issues. For instance, when working in the package mine, some packages are just a pain in the ass. Maybe it's because they're heavy or bulky, or maybe it's because they belong to a big shipping account and you're just sick of seeing the same shit all day. Shipments of dog food check all these boxes. One day, seeing a box of dog food go by for one of my trucks, I picked it up in a blind rage and, from the conveyor belt, launched this 60-pound box maybe 35 feet where it rested in the driver's seat. In and out of work, I would blow up at stupid things, a dog being underfoot or someone blocking an aisle at a grocery store. This subsided for a few weeks when I moved to the burger mines, but quickly returned once the newness wore off. In hindsight, I was stuck avoiding two absurdities. There was the existential absurdity concerning my long-standing identity as a writer that I failed to cultivate as I approached turning 30. Then there was the social absurdity of the treatment of warehouse workers in the United States. In short, and I say this not to say anything negative about warehouse workers themselves, I could not bring myself to answer why and how the hell we were spending our finite lives doing this. There was one more thing to consider about Zagreus when thinking about the absurd and suicide. He's an immortal god. As such, he is shielded from concerns about mortality and despair at the lack of inherent meaning of a finite existence. He has, literally, all the time in the world. However, when looking at his interactions with the characters that populate the House of Hades, particularly those that were mortal, it becomes apparent that Zagreus' struggle throughout the game's narrative can still comment on the absurd from the player's perspective. There are two characters worth talking about here that I would consider Zagreus' mentors throughout the game. Each is guilty in their own way of failing to grapple with the absurd when they are still alive, and each has quite a bit to teach Zagreus about how he can deal with his own relationship to the absurd. Achilles and Sisyphus. Achilles, when you first meet him, is calm and even-handed. Encouraging Zag to be careful in his escape attempts, Achilles implores Zagreus to think about what he's doing as it pertains to the equilibrium of the House of Hades. He's a patient teacher who has Zag's best interest in mind, even if he is torn between his service to Hades and his love of the prince. As you deepen your relationship with Achilles and discover more about his relationship to Patroclus, you find that he is still full of regret and despair, both about what he did in life and what he did to secure Patroclus a comfortable afterlife by signing a contract with Hades, thus separating them forever. I'm going to put the codex entries that Achilles had written about himself and Patroclus up, so you can pause the video and read them before I talk about them. Achilles holds within himself a black hole of despair, which depletes his power to do more than accept his position in death as he did in life. These entries circle in on themselves, trains of thought dissolving into questions Achilles cannot answer for himself. Why should he not risk everything again? Well, why should he? Look what happened the last time he did so in a rage at the walls of Troy. At Troy, he could not avenge Patroclus. In death, he cannot secure a happy existence for him. His time in the afterlife may be limitless, and yet his willpower is not. Achilles is confronted with the same impotence that led him to his death. It is perhaps because Achilles has had eons to grapple with these questions and their possible solutions, or possibly because he sees that Zagreus is limited neither by mortality or a written contract with the dead, that Achilles decides to help Zagreus escape. In Zagreus, there's a glimmer of existential hope, the potential for change. This is a hope that's not misplaced. Likely well after the player has completed the main narrative, they can purchase Achilles' contract, allowing him to visit Patroclus every now and then. When you run into both of them for the first time, Patroclus, jovial at long last, tells Zagreus that nothing is accomplished without risk. In this side quest, possibly my favorite in the game realistically urges the player not to fall into despair. A situation that once seemed hopeless, bound as it was in contracts with the gods, has now been resolved as best it could. All this because Achilles was willing to overcome his feelings of despair, which were so deeply felt that, after he and Zag have a drink and talk about Patroclus, he tells you never to bring it up again. By helping Zagreus in the first place, he risked his position in the House of Hades. By not stopping Zagreus from trying to nullify the contract, he risked it further. And yet, a glimmer of hope remained. While Camus would consider hope to be yet another illusion for us mortals, and I would agree, this side quest is still informative both to Zag and the player on how we might grapple with the absurd in our own lives. From the start, Achilles was aware of the risk involved, yet he acted anyway, refusing to stay in a state of despair. This informed risk could be considered an example of what Camus calls lucidity, or a knowledge that is certain of itself. He knows that he will regret it forever if he does not attempt to reunite with Patroclus. Likewise, if he maintains the comforting illusion that Patroclus has forgotten about him. He also knows that, if Zagreus fails and cannot help him, he may find himself deposed even in death. Nonetheless, he risks it all. Sisyphus' relationship with Zagreus and with absurdity are crucial to understanding Zagreus' journey throughout the game as a whole, largely because he acts as Achilles' opposite. A knave king, as the game calls him, he was known in life for his ability to trick even the gods to get what he wanted. Further, in death, known for his attempt to flee the underworld that involved tying Thanatos up, causing people to stop dying for some time. This attempt to escape death is an example of existential hope enacted by Sisyphus. Unable to handle the absurdity of death, the passing of the known of his mortal life to the unknown of an eternal afterlife, he embraced the illusion that his quick wits would allow him to escape the fate that every other living being had met. This illusion, brought on by existential hope, is why he labors eternally, pushing his boulder up a hill only for it to slip away as he reaches the top. It's why he's ill-regarded by Hades and others in positions of authority in the underworld, constantly accosted by Furies who delight in whipping him when he slacks off. We often call tasks that involve constant repetition and little reward Sisyphean. Anyone who's worked in a warehouse or paid off high-interest debt can see the correlation clearly. In fact, something like doing the dishes or even playing a video game can contain a tinge of the Sisyphean. If you, say, work in a burger or package mine and have very little free time, a run of Hades that ends in a death during the final boss fight, nullifying some narrative progress, may feel Sisyphean in the sense that we often use it. However, Camus sees the metaphor at the heart of the myth of Sisyphus somewhat differently. As he imagines it, Sisyphus does not labor under the illusion that he will succeed in his boulder pushing. Sisyphus is aware of the futility of his labor and takes pleasure in the one respite he has from it, his walk to the bottom. This walk, Camus states, is a time for Sisyphus to reflect without hope or despair, but in a calm reassurance that, until he is at the bottom again, he can enjoy his moment of rest. Intentionally or not, it is Camus' Sisyphus that we meet in Supergiant's Hades. After getting trounced by Megra in my first run through of 2 save files and the Bone Hider in my 3rd save file, I always ran into Sisyphus in my 2nd run. Each time during this first meeting, I was delighted to be met with his calm reassurance that he understood Zagreus' position, and that he was glad to help him get through Tartarus, a far cry from Hypno's helpful advice like don't stand on traps, or Hades' chastisement about all the things Zag has destroyed in his escape attempts. What you come to realize as you give Sisyphus nectar and are eventually introduced to Boldy is the depth of his understanding for Zagreus' position. Although you are a god, your suffering is eerily similar. Heck, one of the game's best moments of artwork is looking out over the underworld from Zagreus' chambers, where the underworld is even visualized as a big hill that you fight your way out of. Further, you meet Persephone on the top of a mountain, only to die shortly after arriving. And if you think that's a coincidence, I've got a Patreon to sell you. As you grow closer to Sisyphus, he admits that he even enjoys his time in the underworld, not only for Boldy's company, but for the time he spends between toiling, the saunter down the same repeating hill. When you release Sisyphus from his contract, he doesn't leave. He stays in Tartarus, exactly where you've met him dozens of times by that point. When asked why, he says it's home. He has grown to love his boulder and the time between the toil. You come to look forward to talking to Dusa, Megra, Skelly, and all the other denizens of the underworld. And while there are times where fighting through the entire game again seemed like a chore to me in my time playing, I would often start another run just to see if I could get another nectar or ambrosia to further my relationship with the character, or if I might have a new unique encounter with Asterius. The one more runnishness of Hades is not unique to this game. It's foundational to games from the arcade cabinets of the 80s and 90s to the current popularity of battle royales. But the shift in this game from looking forward to fighting skeletons to looking forward to reuniting Zagreus' family is nothing short of phenomenal. And that shift wouldn't happen if we didn't get to experience many of the game's characters struggle with the absurdity of their existence. This game not only relishes the idea that we might literally grapple with the absurd powers that have sway over our lives, which we cannot fully understand, but encourages us to do what we can about it. I leave Sisyphus at the foot of the mountain. One always finds one's burden again. But Sisyphus teaches the higher fidelity that negates the gods and raises rocks. He too concludes that all is well. This universe, henceforth without a master, seems to him neither sterile nor futile. Each atom of that stone, each mineral flake of that night-filled mountain, in itself forms a world. The struggle itself towards the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. Before I finished Hades, it had motivated me to reread The Myth of Sisyphus. Maybe I was just projecting the Sisyphean structure of my own day onto this game I spent so much of my precious free time playing. That's probably why this video is about the game's relationship to the absurd instead of, I don't know, something related to Zagreus' struggle to find himself and reunite his family, which is probably what the developers intended the game to be about. And probably why, at first, I felt the ending of the game and the epilogue were a little odd. We sort of talked about this earlier, but as the narrative progresses it becomes sort of a melodrama about Zagreus trying to convince Persephone to move back to the underworld. She had left largely because Zag had been a stillborn birth, and she was never told that Nyx breathed life back into him. There are secrets kept and shadowy motivations whose revelations seem to veer away from the absurd. However, the familio-political drama behind the scenes and Zag's reaction to discovering that drama centers the family as one of the institutions in which the absurd is ripe for exploration. Throughout the game, Zagreus' understanding of what a father, mother, or other family member are is cast into doubt. As he sees how these roles are fulfilled in various ways, he has to situate himself both within his family of Olympians and within the House of Hades. When you confront Hades for the final time in the game's main narrative, he doesn't fight you. He gives up. He knows that, even if he beats you this time, he's delaying the inevitable. It's a jarring moment. Hades is out of the calm arrogance in his own power and the anger he feels when he loses. Hades here is experiencing a moment of lucidity. He knows that defeat will not stop Zagreus, and that he can only prepare to deal with the fallout of whatever happens. It's surprisingly mature for a character like Hades to let go of his vindictive anger, a trait that many characters comment upon, and to be aware of the futility of his own struggle. It's a moment so captivating that I stood in the boss arena I'd fought him in more than a dozen times already, just letting it sink in. Immediately after this, Zagreus talks Persephone in Greece for the last time. Narratively, I feel like this is a low point for the game. You arrive in Persephone's orchard only to find out that she's already made arrangements to travel back to the underworld. Charon is even waiting for you. You both hop on his boat toward the House of Hades. This is a very neat credit sequence, but it also kind of makes the narrative stakes of fighting out of Hades 10 times at this point a little rinky-dinky. Once Zag and Persephone return home, too, the narrative stakes seem to continue their quick deflation, especially as Zagreus' escape attempts are officially sanctioned by Hades himself. Zagreus becomes Paul Blart Hellcop. And yes, I'm aware of what a denouement is. I was a creative writing teacher, for crying out loud. In truth, I get why this quick turn from tragedy to comedy happens. For one, it preserves the gameplay loop, casting all of the character interactions in a new light and allowing for some sort of narrative conclusion. In my own experience playing the game, this had little effect on my enjoyment of the hack-and-slash portion of the game, and there were still side quests to explore, prophecies to fulfill, and characters to give nectar to. I suppose the tension between Hades and the underworld, Persephone and Greece, and Zagreus trying to reunite them could have been maintained indefinitely, but that would have been unsatisfying in its own way, like a TV series that doesn't know when to end. And if you've ever had a parent who watched a soap opera religiously, you'd know what I'm talking about. Heck, my stepmom watched Guiding Light, a show that has, between TV and audio performances, 18,262 episodes. Secondly, this happens because the game ultimately is not a tale of powerless struggle against the realities of our lives. Hades seems to turn away from the absurd at the conclusion of the narrative because it specifically wants to empower the player through a story about a young man who can change the world around him through suffering. And yet, just because we have a comedy, a story where everything turns out well, that doesn't mean that the game abandons the absurd. For instance, Zagreus succeeds in part because he will not give up the hope, which causes him to destroy himself over and over again. It's important to note two things. The first is that we should avoid conflating absurdity with powerlessness. Camus writes, "If there is a personal fate, there is no higher destiny." Or, at least there is, but one which he concludes is inevitable and despicable. For the rest, he knows himself to be the master of his days. Camus' ideas on freedom are a little more complicated than I can describe in this video. Just read The Stranger if you want to know more about that. But one thing to keep in mind is that Camus imagines Sisyphus happy because he imagines him free. Sisyphus carves out for himself a moment of respite in his trek down the mountain. Zagreus, in the ending of this tragedy-turned-comedy about family, does the same. In a sort of ironic twist, the change he creates by bringing Persephone home forces him to continue his attempts to escape from the underworld in order to fool the Olympians. The second is a common critique of existentialism in that it is very limited in advocating for systemic change. Zagreus has carved out a place for himself in his family and in the afterlife that largely plays by the rules. Those rules require him to constantly destroy himself. Because he still recognizes Hades' power, he must still free Achilles, Sisyphus, and Orpheus from their contracts in an improved fashion. He must appeal to Nyx when Medusa is banished from the house. And Zagreus must even make his escape attempts part of the natural ecosystem in which he lives. In some respects, he is in a similar place at the beginning and the end of the game. And yet, after each slide down the Styx, he has his Sisyphean moment of respite. He returns home to see everyone he has taken comfort in and, most importantly, his long-lost mother Persephone. In the face of absurd circumstances, he has exercised his freedom to carve out a place of respite between the painful struggles of his existence. Like Sisyphus, he has learned to love his boulder. Saying this, I'm reminded of a guy I worked with at the burger mines. He reminded me of my dad, probably because he was of a similar age and disposition, but lacking in the freakish mechanical knowledge my dad had built up over his lifetime that would allow him to keep steady employment while maintaining said disposition. He would work temp jobs until he had enough money to not work for a while, and Sisyphus-like, he felt no need to impress his coworkers or bosses outside of his job duties. He would always wear a comically oversized beanie that made his head look mushroom-esque. About twice a week, he made a point of taking this beanie off during breaks, pointing at his bottle cap size ear gauges and telling me, "Man, they want us to take these out for work, fuck 'em. I don't give a shit, I don't fucking take these out for nobody. I wear a goddamn hat. They want to talk shit about it? I walk out on their asses. I'll go to Walgreens, fuck it." I'm not advocating that you do this, far from it actually. This guy had no financial security, but then again a lot of my coworkers at the Burger Mines didn't either, and they didn't yell at their bosses. But although he may understand it differently than I do, he was aware of the trade-off he was making. While some of us had a chance at financial security and he didn't, our gauged friend had the chutzpah to at least not fully play into the illusions we had to believe as warehouse workers. Primarily, the illusion that our jobs were anything other than a ridiculous way to bust our tails so company executives could make a much better living than we ever could. Lacking the ability to change the overarching system that relied on temp workers and anti-union sentiment that's been astroturfed for about as long as there have been unions, you might do well to alleviate your own misery just a little bit. Now, this isn't the part of the video where I tell you that you can't find fault with social systems unless you clean your room or something. It is the part of the video where I say that if we look at Hades and Camus together, we might consider that alleviating our own misery is better than being doomer-pilled and wallowing in our own misery, which also won't lead to any meaningful social change, even if it is good for internet engagement on the online left. Boy, am I gonna wear egg on my face when the Final Fantasy VI video comes out. Possibly inspired by this guy's willingness to admit that we were working a stupid job, I quit the Burger Mines to look for other work. I recognize that the burgers may not have been my boulders to push. They were, in some sense, a continuation of my avoidance of my own experience with absurdity. Ultimately, I found a new job with a nonprofit, and although it's still essentially warehouse work, the idea that my work has more social value than a product that no one needs is comforting. If there is some sort of a call to action at the end of this too long essay, it's that just as Hades' narrative reflects on the gameplay loop of roguelikes, just as Sisyphus guides Zag to reflect on his position in the House of Hades, you might look for whatever causes you to reflect on the world around you. There's a way to learn to love your boulder. I do appreciate you sticking around. This video has been a lot of work to put together with a big learning curve. I think the last time I made a video project of any sort was some sort of parody commercial in middle school. Thank you to Lucas for editing and to Adam for listening to my ideas. There's a link to Lucas's website in the description if you need your own editing services. Because there's so much good games writing on YouTube right now, and I respect that both you and I have other things to do, I plan on releasing one video each month of varying lengths. Many will be shorter than this one, especially if they come out around the time of a long video. If you're interested in my next couple videos about getting over it, Final Fantasy VI and Disco Elysium, there's a Patreon link in the description. Of course, I appreciate any donations if it doesn't negatively impact you. I appreciate you sharing the video just as much. Later.